Welcome to our sixth B3D webinar on the concept of unifying principles and how they might apply to B3D. I am Norbert Huller. I'm both a moderator and host for today. We had a good lineup of people registering for this session. We've had a bit of issues with Philip Ling, who is in as a viewer. I hope the rest of the folks are going to be able to join shortly. So I'll just let you quickly scan that list. We also have one person who, Prashant from Delhi, who is going to also come in as a viewer, again, due to some restrictions in Google+. So let us get started. This presentation came out of an interview that was published in Zygote Quarterly, issue 9, with Randy Olson and Brian Palermo. Randy raised this concept of a narrative or a unifying principle, and used as an example some of the work done by Dobzhansky, and I'll let you just read that quote from an essay he wrote in 1973. So what Randy challenged us was to come up with a unifying principle for B3D. He said, fill in the blanks. Nothing in biologically inspired design makes sense except in the light of a statement, some narrative, something that provides cohesion to bio-inspired design. Needless to say, that is easier said than done, which is why we're here. What I'm going to do is give you my thoughts on what this unifying principle might look like, what some of the criteria are, and I'm going to use evolution as an example, if only because that's what Dobzhansky used in his essay. So I came up with a series of criteria, and the first one was that it has to be insightful. It has to make sense of what we have observed so far. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it. I'm going to pull out one of the last paragraphs in The Origin of Species. And I'll let you read that. It's a bit long. So the interesting part of this is how evolution has made sense of both the diversity and the unity of life. Whereas prior to the concept of evolution, really it was scattered observations. There were tons of people collecting fossils, but there was really no framework in which to put those observations that would make sense. Evolution came along, and suddenly the pieces fell into place. Darwin and his peers provided a tremendous amount of insight that suddenly pulled together all of those disparate pieces of information. So that's sort of the first criteria. The second one is that the unifying principle needs to create opportunities. So again, I think Darwin actually understated the considerable revolution in natural history. If you think of all of the things that probably would not have come about, all the research, all of the insights that would not have come about if it hadn't been for the concept of evolution, it's going to be a pretty long list. So again, I won't belabor that. I think another criteria is that it has to be accessible. And this is a discussion that Janice and I had. Oftentimes we use language when we talk about bio-inspired design that the layman doesn't understand, that doesn't make sense to the layman. Interestingly enough, a good chunk of the Origin of Species talks about pigeons. I mean, at the time, pigeon fanciers were quite well known within Victorian society. They had bred large numbers of variants from the original rock pigeon, and I've pulled out a picture here of a French tumbler. You know, this is again a bird that is a variant of the rock pigeon, has different coloration, also has different behavior. When it flies, it actually does backflips. So in other words, through human effort, we were able to develop a variant quite different from the original species. And Darwin relied heavily on that. But at the same time, he's using examples that people would understand. So it is not a book that was written for scientists per se, although, you know, again, how many people got value out of it remains to be seen. And by the way, there's a list in Wikipedia that shows 800 plus domestic pigeon breeds. So again, it shows you, you know, what we can do just through breeding. I think the other key part is that the unifying principle has to be defensible. It has to be testable, and it has to be tested. And evolution has, you know, stood the test of time in both aspects. Although what is really quite interesting is Darwin published just before Mendel published his work on genetics. So Darwin really didn't have any of the underlying mechanism by which evolution worked, which may explain why it's 478 pages of very detailed observation, very detailed research. And if you ever get a chance to read The Origin of Species, you will find there are sections that will literally put you to sleep. But again, the strength of it was that he was able to tell a very, very compelling story that has subsequently you know, permeated our thinking. And last but not least, it asks fundamental questions. So I use a little graphic here. Those of you that do project management will recognize that it's a critical path map. And critical path maps are very simple. You have a project that you need to finish by a certain date. There are tasks that are going to get you there. There are some tasks that if you don't get them done on time, your project will not make it. They are the ones that are time dependent. And I think the fundamental questions fall into that same class of things. There are fundamental questions that if you can't answer them or don't answer them well, you're not going to get to end of job. You're not going to be really getting to the core of what the issue is that you're trying to explain. And again, I think evolution clearly has asked and answered those really tough questions. And in fairness, is still asking tough questions that we still struggle with. So it is an ongoing thing. So those are sort of my 5 off-the-cuff criteria of what a unifying principle might look like. So what I'm going to do next is I'm just going to whip through 3 ideas that have been associated with bio-inspired design. Again, I don't think any of these are unifying principles yet, because I don't think the hard work is being done to satisfy the 5 criteria. But they'll give you some ideas of where the discussion following this might lead us. So the first one, sorry, and I should just go back one step. Clearly, a unifying principle isn't a grand theory of everything. I mean, evolution doesn't explain everything in biology. It is going to look at a specific area, a specific aspect. And again, we may look at only part of bio-inspired design and find a powerful unifying principle that explains that part. All right, on to those ideas. So the very first one is nature has built up a storehouse of innovation. 3.8 million years of problem solving. We can apply those solutions to human problems, and in the process, the human species will become more fit. We will fit in better. So this is the B3.8 story. I wasn't actually able to find a quote for this, and if anybody finds one, let me know and I'll add it to the list. I pulled out two others from Julian Vincent's work. One of them is his work on how nature solves problems, how we solve problems. So the first graph shows that energy, which is the dark red, is the predominant way in which we solve problems at multiple scales. And the second one that comes up a lot is substance, the yellow at the bottom. Now, when he looked at examples of biological or natural solutions, he found a totally different picture. Energy is, in fact, the smallest component, and that it is information and structure which predominate, again, at almost all scales. So he talked about in his Royal Society paper the differences in solution pathways that we see in technology and we see in biology. So again, that is an idea that I think could be turned into a unifying principle. And I know that Julian is continuing to work in this area to try to provide that research aspect, the details. And one other one that he's talked a lot about is this difference between making versus being. So again, this goes back to Janine's heat, beat, and treat. What he's saying is we use energy to, first of all, homogenize materials. We beat the structure out of them, the information out of them, and then we use more energy to incorporate or to impose structure onto those materials. So we are, in a sense, outside of the system, imposing our will on the system. He says nature, on the other hand, doesn't have the flexibility of doing that because energy is in such short supply. So it has to work with embedded information. It has to use hierarchy to increase scale, all of those things. So again, here are two different ways of looking at what we do, what nature does, that potentially could be turned into a unifying principle. So we have a little under 40 minutes, let's say 35 minutes for discussion. What I'd like to do is have a bit of a brainstorming session. And again, we're not going to come up with the unifying principle in this talk or in this period, but what I'd like to do is come up with ideas that could be turned into or could lead to a unifying principle for some area of B3D. So again, standard rules of brainstorming apply. Postpone judgment. We'll leave that for another day. Let's see if we can build on the previous contributors' ideas. So it's like a relay race. You got to accept the baton. You've got to move it forward. And you have to pass it on to somebody else. So what I'd like to do is, if anybody has any ideas, let's see how far we can run with it, and then if we kind of run out of steam, we'll let the next person suggest an idea, and we'll run with that for a while, and we'll see how that goes. You can use the unified chat at the far right, sort of to post ideas. If we're in the midst of something, and then what we'll do is I'll pull them off there, and we'll use that to see the next discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to turn off screen share here, and I'm going to go into collaboration mode. Mics are now live. Does anybody have, first of all, any comments on what I've showed so far? And if not, who would like to start opening up with an idea?
Well, someone has to say something.
Yes!
So in that spirit, I'll say something. Um, First of all, I think this is a really important discussion because as I see, I have been in this area for about 8 years now, and with every year I see exponential growth in the number of directions people are taking, which is really good. But that also suggests that we don't really have unifying principles yet. We're all searching for those unifying principles that might show us what the next big steps should be. We don't quite understand them yet. So looking for unifying principles is really, really important. So thanks for hosting this. One unifying principle that I have been thinking a little bit about, and I'll just throw it up here. I don't know whether it's a unifying principle, it's a good one, bad one. But I increasingly think that at least in my lab, what we have been doing has been perhaps not as useful as it could be because we have been focusing on organisms rather than on systems. So all the tools we build and all the case studies of biological inspired design that have come across are always of the kind that here is a design problem of some kind, here is some organism which has some properties or functions, and this organism has this mechanism. Let's transfer this mechanism to the new problem. Um, so, insofar as I know, almost every single case study has been of this kind that people have. So whether you have the boxcar or some organism to some design problem. But I wonder now, having worked on this area for about 8 years, whether that's the most useful, productive way of thinking about the problem. Perhaps there's the unifying principle. Perhaps the action is not in terms of the organism, but in terms of the organism's interaction with the system around it, with the world around it. And instead of thinking about how the organism functions, perhaps we want to be asking ourselves the question, how do all of these organisms live together in some world? How do the organisms interact with each other or interact with the world around them? And if we ask that question, then that completely changes our perspective on it and leads to very, very different ways of thinking about how we could be doing biological inspired. Yeah, that's what we are playing around with in our lab right now.
And I think that's a very, very insightful way of looking at it. I mean, I sometimes wonder if we're doing analogical reasoning, the assumption being is that there are lots of points of intersection between the biological domain and the technical domain. Maybe there are more of those points of intersection as we go up from organisms into systems, because we are dealing with more fundamental rules, fundamental laws, or principles, if you want to call it that. So in a sense, maybe it's going to get easier as we look at principles, at systems.
I think the question of scale or levels, hierarchical levels, is really very important. And some of my research related to successful knowledge transfer versus unsuccessful knowledge transfer has shown that indeed there are certain levels that have led to better success than others for very different reasons, which is also super interesting. I think that emergence and interactions are indeed ridiculously important. So thank you so much for bringing that up, Ashok. But I also think that all of those things still do fall under the umbrella of function, and that instead of being achieved in some way at a smaller or lower level, those functions at the higher levels are indeed achieved by interaction. And so, for example, if we think about the function of transferring energy from a supersystem into a subsystem, we can probably more readily understand how that would happen at the cellular or tissue level. But at the higher levels of community, for example, I think that those functions are achieved by interaction. predator-prey relationships, for example, mutualistic relationships. And so I think looking at those higher levels is indeed more relevant to us with respect to achieving sort of sustainable needs and sustainable goals and that type of thing. And so we definitely need to be exploring it. And I also think, though, that it falls very well under the umbrella of at least I hope so. I have more to think about it. But I think what you're saying, Ashok, is indeed very important for understanding sort of the whole, what's the word, gradient, I guess, of importance, and it's all unified under this idea of function, I think. By understanding the function of these relationships, of these interactions, I think we can better transfer.
So Janice, is this the same as interdependent relationships that you posted on the chat?
Yes. Yeah, it's right on.
Do you want to expand on that a bit, please?
I'm thinking that if we look at B3D in the light of interdependent relationships, as Shoshona just described, that contribute to a function that might get us from the organism to the system all in one concept. Because the relationship is the system and the function is the organism.
Okay.
In a highly simplistic way.
And again, we're throwing out ideas here. I mean, this is certainly quite different from what is often associated with the idea of bio-inspired design or biomimicry. So I think it's really valuable that we get some of these ideas out, and then in subsequent sections we can then explore how we then add some meat to the bones. Anybody else want to chime in on this particular one? Ray, you're still muted.
Yeah. Am I tapped in? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. All right. So I don't know if I'm saying something different or I'm just describing what's already said different in my lens to grasp what's saying here. The lens I use is that you can look at the organism or you can look at the system. Or I would reframe that and say you're looking at a thing or you're looking at the context. And for me, one way, I don't know if this is leading to some principle or anything, but I do operate or behave in the context to understand the thing, not the thing itself. And the other point I'd make back to what you offered in this notion of making versus being. When we're making something, I think we're working at a functional level. When we're at a being state, we're working at the essence of it. So my lens I bring to the table, for better or worse, is that if you look at the thing as a function, you don't really know it. If you understand it as a living system, you might appreciate its essence. And it's like with human beings. You can deal with people as a machine and fix it, or you can look at them as an essence and see what the relationship needs to be. So it's a matter of the lens, and it's part of what doesn't work for me for biomimicry is that it seems to be focused on problem solving versus the relationship, the essence, and then work into some relationship that needs to be evolved versus solving something. But again, I offer that as my lens.
I would agree, Ray, and I would suggest that focusing on the function without an understanding of the relationship will actually be dangerous.
Now, I'll share something with you that came out of the interview with Randy and Brian. They asked me, so what is your underlying principle? I gave them the nature storehouse. And Brian made a very interesting comment. And again, we have to put this in context. He is an improv expert. He's not a scientist. He's not a biologist. He may never have heard of biomimicry before the interview. His comment was, but nature hasn't had to deal with us until very recently. So, and I think this bridges to the relationship, and it also bridges to the context. Maybe we need to look at the relationship, the evolving relationship of humans with all of those subsystems, all of those systems that support us, rather than looking for solutions that we can parachute in. In other words, wouldn't it be nice if? Yeah, it would be, but we're dealing with a human species that is extremely successful. There is a human context, and it is very, very powerful. We are a force of nature. At the same time, that's something we have to deal with. If we could understand it again using Ray's lens, will opportunities arise to adjust, to tweak, to redirect our relationship? And because we're starting with an understanding of what our current relationship is, will it be easier to implement some of these changes rather than trying to impose a solution from outside? Okay, the audience has gone quiet.
No, we're all thinking about what you said.
Okay.
Well, to build on some of the previous discussion, things that Shoshana said, Ray said, Janice said, and Norbert, you said, what I struggle with is that mentally I can make the shift from an organism to a system, from just function to interaction. But then if I want to take it one step further and say, okay, how do we now operationalize it so that we can build a methodology out of it? Then that sounds like a very, very hard thing to do. I can see at least a partial methodology for transferring some knowledge about organisms to design problems. But with systems, coming up with a methodology becomes, I think, doubly hard, partly because it's for several reasons. One reason is it's not clear where to draw the system boundary. At least as a non-biologist, it's not clear to me where to draw the system boundary. The other is that, at least my understanding of the biological literature is that biological literature often doesn't draw the boundaries clearly enough to operationalize it in an interesting manner. And so then the question becomes, if we cannot operationalize, well, let me not go that far. Let me just say operationalizing it becomes much harder.
And personally, I think this is a good thing, because it suggests that we are asking hard questions. If it was a simple question, it would have been answered before, we wouldn't be here. So yeah, these are very, very difficult questions. They're going to take work to resolve. To me, that's an indicator that we're on perhaps a rocky path, but a potentially productive path. So Taryn, you've been very quiet.
Yes, because I came in very late and missed the beginning of the conversation.
Oh, okay.
So I'm trying to catch up. I think just in terms of like drawing the lines around the boundaries, I think this is, I don't know if I'm scale jumping too much here, given where the conversation has been so far, but for me, this is where planetary boundaries comes in. I think that allows us to draw a line around the context that we have to deal with in the big picture of things, right? So when we're trying to apply a biological strategy to a particular design or to a particular an analog or a metaphor, right, to a particular system, it has to be sort of operationalized in a smaller sense. But at least that big picture of the biological context, I think, can be described with planetary boundaries. I think that's the best thing I've seen so far, anyway.
So we're starting to slip into, I think, a level of granularity that perhaps we should reserve for a subsequent discussion. I think we've got a general agreement that there's something worthwhile in looking at relationships and looking at context, or as Ray said, looking at essence, however we define that. So what I'd like to do is if we sort of run this idea, are there other ideas that we should also be considering in terms of, actually, let me just bring up a comment that Philip made. I'm going to post this up here, if I can remember how to do it. This is a comment that Philip Ling contributed. So I'm going to keep talking so that it continues to show up. I mean, this is an ongoing discussion in the B3D field. Is it just biology? Should we be looking at the natural context, which includes all of the inanimate things? And I mean, my personal sense is, although the biology has the level of complexity that makes it interesting, that biology is heavily dependent on, if you want to call it, the laws of physics. So yes, we have to consider that. We have to look at beyond just the organism, right? It's the organism in context, the organism relationship to others, and clearly the organism has a relationship with the non-animate world.
You know, if I try to answer that question, the question, or nothing in biomimetics makes sense except in light of blank. If we're talking about biomimetics for sustainability, I still come back to nothing in biomimetics makes sense except in light of evolution. I feel like it's the same thing. I mean, I guess it's kind of because I view sustainability as a process of human evolution, and learning how to, I think right now we're using technology in a really clunky way that's not very well adapted. So taking that a step further, it's all about an evolutionary process again, anyway. I don't know if that gets us back to where we started.
No, Taryn, I love that you said that, because that's kind of the same ending that I was thinking about at the very beginning of this conversation too. So it's perfect.
Okay.
What I can contribute to this question about sort of the difference between community and ecosystem is that the mistaken terminology is frequently made, and so when designers or developers are describing the biological level at which their biological model, from which their biological model comes, they often confuse community, which is sort of the groupings of all organisms and all species, and ecosystem, which actually isn't. Communities aren't. It's sort of the only non-nested part of the hierarchy, which I find extremely interesting, because it isn't a collection of communities. It's actually communities as they interact with their abiotic environment. And we see this frequently, and I'm sure it's probably not worth spending too much time pointing out this common misconception. And I think, but what I do think is that fortunately we're taking our models, our biological models, at whichever level, and an organism is definitely not my favorite one, and we're applying it to another system that has the same restrictions, the same limitations, so gravity, and that has the same access to the same types of resources, potentially. And so while I find the sort of abiotic environment to be very, very important, I see it as a sort of oh, I'm losing my words today, but a sort of means of leveling out the playing field, in that we're not trying to apply these principles or ideas to a completely different planet with very different abiotic challenges. And so understanding, the interactions is very important. But I still do feel as though interaction is used in order to achieve function, just like process and form are as well.
Let's go and explore a little bit Terrence's comment. Is it as straightforward as saying evolution is the unifying principle for bio-inspired design?
I think that is a positional statement.
It's definitely not wrong. Maybe, but I think we could change the word biomimetics in that statement to be virtually anything. And so I'm not sure that evolution sort of characterizes the uniqueness of what biomimetics is, but I think evolution is fundamental. The other problem with evolution, though, is that it's not always adaptive, and I think it is important to be picky about what we select as being transferable, and so I do see it as a sort of subset of evolution. And I loved your point, Norbert. At the very beginning, Tara and Norbert said that that this type of activity could increase human fitness, and I love that. I think that's really great. But evolution absolutely has to be taken into account.
Can we sort of riff off the idea of evolution? Maybe as a concept it is very large, but are there aspects of evolution that are perhaps more directly germane to what we mean by bio-inspired design or biomimetics or biomimicry?
I just came out of giving a lecture about life's principles. So all I can think about is like the different components of life's principles and how evolution is presented in that context. So, I mean, the three basic mechanisms are mutation, replication of genes, and what's the third one? Sexual selection. So the mixing of genes. Am I making sense? Sorry, I have post-presentation brain. So those three mechanisms, but if you take those three mechanisms by themselves, they kind of lose the meaning of evolution. It's kind of all together that they make sense. So I don't know if that's helpful.
Anybody want to carry the ball a little further?
So I don't know if this is carrying the ball further or not, but perhaps this is what Taryn and Shoshana is saying, or at least I want clarification. So another issue often arises is in design, we're constantly focusing on product, but not on the process. And perhaps part of what you're saying is that the process of evolution is important, not just the result of the process of evolution at any stage of evolution. So these principles that you're talking about of mutation, for example, and other three other, that those will lead to a process, and we want to be looking at the process by which biology achieves something, not just the product that that process led to. Because right now what we're doing is to build this, to say, okay, we have a design problem and product design, and we're going to look at some organism which is a result of the evolutionary process and transfer something from the organism, from the product to the design problem, without looking at the process that led to that organism. Are you then suggesting that that process is equally important, or perhaps even more important?
Process is huge, and again, though, I'm not sure that sort of the process of evolution is the level at which we can most efficiently transfer, because it's slow and it's very wasteful. And it's also random, at least the initial mechanisms by a mutation, and that's not something that I think would be very useful to the field of biomimetics. However, there are certain aspects of the process that I do find extremely intriguing and applicable, and that is the idea of retrofitting. Evolution is very good at retrofitting, at dealing with what already exists and changing it. And so that's probably the area of evolution that I find most relevant to some of the challenges within biomimetics. There are other processes, though, biological processes, not specifically at the scale of evolution, at lower scales, that are fundamentally important. And in fact, if we just take a look at the different sort of industrial sectors, is by far the most relevant to all of those 5 sectors in terms of being able to transfer knowledge. Form is the most limiting, and certainly the ideas of interactions are also prevalent throughout the different sectors where we could apply biomimetic principles.
There is one more thought that comes to my mind. I do not know how to relate it to the previous thought, so you do the relationship for me. Let's ignore biology and biomimetics for just a second and just look at design per se. On one side, we as humans designed products like, let's say, a smartphone. I'm sure all of us have some smartphone. But on the other hand, it's not the smartphone which is important. When we're designing the smartphone, we are really designing a human behavior. We're really designing a human interaction. So a completely different way of looking at design is not to think in terms of products that we design, but to think in terms of human ecologies that we're designing, human interactions, human behaviors. What the smartphone has done is that it has allowed us to communicate in ways that we could never do it earlier. It has changed the world in some way. It is that behavior, that interaction which is important. The product is simply a tool to get to that. But when we think of design, we always think in terms, or we often think of design in terms of product design, or perhaps sometimes process design, not designing of this interaction among humans or behaviors of humans, which goes back to the same issue of earlier that we were talking about, not thinking of biomimicry or biologically inspired design in terms of products, and thinking in terms of interactions that occur there. And it is those interactions that are, I don't know where I'm going with this. I'm just sharing here all the thoughts going on in our lab right now, where we are sort of trying to move from where we were earlier, from the organism level, to thinking in terms of systems, function, process, interactions. But how to operationalize any one of them is a huge challenge.
You know, I actually really like, okay, so I really like this idea of the process of evolution. So, Shel, I hear you that the outcomes of evolution are not necessarily sustainable, but to date, I think you said something along those lines. The process of, well, anyhow, but the process to date of things evolving has been, in one form or another, sustainable. Not necessarily at the species level,
right?
But at the sphere of life evolving.
That's it. It's the outcomes of natural selection that I find to be more interesting than the outcomes of evolution, right? And it's really just these like specific things. I think we're all talking about the same thing. We're just struggling with different vocabularies, which is just fascinating and wonderful to listen to. I'm learning so much. And yeah, no, with a small group, I feel like there is sort of everybody's kind of on the same path. We're just using very different words, and I find that marvelous.
Yeah. But I do really like this idea of the process of evolution guiding what biomimetics is, and more importantly than evolution itself, it is the idea of trial and error guiding what is good design. Like evolution, natural selection being, the process of natural selection being what good, appropriate design, quote unquote, good design is, right? What appropriate design is. I don't know. I think there's something in there.
But Taryn, my designer friends will then say, my friends coming from engineering and architecture will say, but then all design is of that kind, isn't it? I mean, design is rarely static. So if you think of in terms of any product or any system or any process that humans design, it almost always evolves. So building design has evolved enormously over the centuries, for example.
I see. Mm-hmm.
So if we think just in terms of the design by its very nature is iterative and evolutionary, just keeps on changing. So whether it follows the principle of biological evolution is a different matter.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
I just had an idea, though, and maybe this is a perspective that isn't necessarily taken in design, that is in natural selection. I get my students to play with spoons and marshmallows, and and then I introduce this mutation, which is the fork, into the system at a very low frequency within the population, and they predict that the forks are actually going to be much more successful at acquiring marshmallows than spoons. What they don't take into account is the stickiness of the marshmallow. And so when we play out the simulation, I will get to a point in a second, I promise. When we play out the simulation, what happens is the forks are eliminated from the population because the marshmallows are too sticky, and so they can't take them off in order to acquire another one. So that's a failed design. And so we would remove that, right? Maybe. And the thing is, though, that what they don't recognize is that the environment can change to make that from a detrimental mutation to a beneficial mutation. And so we introduce a change whereby they are allowed within the rules of the game to remove the marshmallow from the tines of the fork with their hands. And therefore it becomes adaptive. And then we play the simulation again, and forks outcompete and do outsurvive the spoons. And so maybe if we're testing different designs and we realize that they're not working within the environment, what we don't always realize is that the environment itself is also changeable, as we've seen with real cases of natural selection, not just forks and spoons and marshmallows.
I think this is an important concept that we often forget, is that the environment affects the product affects the environment. It is a dynamic relationship that, unless you're aware of that, can lead to some bad decisions being made. I'd like to throw up a comment here that Philip typed in. Unfortunately, he's in the viewer status at the moment. So let me get that one up. And I think this is an interesting perspective insofar as it's true. If you look at the case studies, they tend to be, as Ashok said, organism-based. They tend to be the results of evolution rather than process of evolution. Yet, on the other hand, a lot of concerns have been raised that we're not seeing a lot of new case studies. We're not seeing a lot of really interesting case studies. So perhaps looking at a slightly different way of what do we mean by bio-inspired design could be of some value. Okay, I'm trying to keep an eye on the clock here. We've got about 6 minutes left. So what I'm going to ask first of all is, or what I'm going to say first of all, is I want to really thank all of you for your insights. I've heard sort of 3 or maybe 4 ideas discussed here. I guess the first question I have is, do we need another one of these sessions and continue the brainstorming? The 3 or 4 ideas have all been, in one sense, variations on a theme, so they may actually coalesce down into one. I have a sense that there must be other ideas out there that we could turn into unifying principles. So should we schedule another one of these? Again, just a brainstorming session.
I think that would be great, and mostly, my motivation is obviously more academic driven, but I kind of see a paper coming out of this, Maybe not necessarily, the title that has a definite conclusion, but certainly I think that the contributions that have been made by thoughtful and educated people, and I think the community would certainly benefit from some of these thoughts. I would very much like to participate in further discussions.
So there's one vote here for, let's do another one of these brainstorming type sessions.
I think that's a great idea, but and to build on what Shoshana is saying, an article for something like ZQ might be a good goal to have. So.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I think going into this, I missed the beginning, obviously, but was there, who was the audience? Who is the audience for this conversation or for this statement?
At the moment, you are.
Oh, okay. I want to have another conversation then.
That
was easy.
I'd be interested in testing some of those 3 or 4 ideas that we've come up with against the criteria that you presented at the beginning, Norbert.
Okay. So that would be my second option, or my second proposal. Catalina, you wanted to get in there?
Sorry, I apologize, but my other meeting rolled into this meeting, and yeah, I intended to have this time for you guys, but anyways, I do want to have a conversation with you, so I would like to have another opportunity to participate if possible. I was reading all the notes that you have on the side of the chat, and yeah, I think that I would like to participate. There's a lot of things that I want to say, but we have only 3 minutes.
Okay. So what I'm going to suggest is I will schedule another session like this to continue brainstorming. There is another option, and that is how do we progress from the idea phase into the testing phase, the other criteria that we listed. How do we start turning these things into unifying principles? Is that something that we want to also start doing, perhaps doing in parallel, or are we better off at this point in saying, let's have another brainstorming session, document what comes out of it, and then as a follow-on to that, we'll start drilling down another layer?
Norbert, can we make homework for everyone? Since I'm a professor, I'll make homework for everyone, including myself. And that is that, so we had some ideas. If each one of us can think in terms of one concrete example that instantiates an idea. So, so it's easy for me to talk in terms of systems and interactions, but let's take one example of biomimetics or biomimicry, whatever we want to call it, where there is some kind of a system that whose knowledge gets transferred to the human area. Now, if we can come up with a small set of examples, then that can make our discussion a lot more tangible and concrete.
And I think that's actually a very good point. I mean, I'm going to do the usual. I'll annotate, or I'll index the video, I'll annotate the discussion. If you can send me some of those examples, I'll include them in the annotations so that it already takes those ideas from the level of, high idea into something a little bit more concrete. And I think that'll also be useful in terms of inspiring us to brainstorm a bit further, because now all of a sudden you can say, okay, I can see where that's coming from. I have a different idea, and maybe it was driven out of an example, out of a tangible. So we can go the other way.
Okay. Coming too late to the conversation, Norbert, for me would be beneficial if I can watch what the conversation, if that's possible, or something before me getting into writing anything. If that's
right. Possible. Within about 15 minutes, it'll be up on YouTube.
Excellent.
But what I'll do is, as I said, I will create an index so that it's easy to get. I don't know what that just was. What I'll do is I'll create an index and I'll make some annotations of our discussion just so that it's easy to find things. But absolutely. Okay, we're starting to get, close to the hour. In fact, about another minute. Any last-minute comments?
Just a big thank you to you for organizing this. This was a difficult one.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you.
I have to give all credit to Randy Olson for bringing up the idea. If you haven't read the interview, it's actually a very interesting interview. It raises questions that really hadn't occurred to me. Not just about although the thrust was on communication, little points kind of came up in that interview that I found really quite interesting. And it's one that I'm going to mine for future webinars as well. Alrighty, I'm going to post a PDF of the charts today. At the end of those charts, there are a couple of references. The essay by, oops, hang on a minute. Nobody can see that. Let's go back. So here are the references. As I said, I will post those to the website. The Royal Society paper from which those charts were taken without approval. A presentation that Vincent had done at the NSF workshop, and let's say a little more popular discussion in terms of this comparison between biological and technological systems. And he actually made a very interesting comment in that article where he said, organisms in nature have it easy because they are stuck in the system. They only have to worry about the little bits that they interact with. Because we're outside the system, we actually have to understand it all. We have to figure out all of the moving parts and everything else. So if we were, in fact, to think a little bit more embedded in the system, maybe our lives would become easier. So there's another interesting speculation. Alrighty, without further ado, thanks again to all of you, and we will pick this up relatively shortly. Should we say perhaps in 2 weeks? Is that a good time to perhaps to have another one of these discussions?
Yeah.
Okay, around about the same time?
I'm happy to report that I'll be in Hawaii for the next 2 weeks.
Oh, lucky you.
I know.
So maybe we'll...
for me too, but yeah, same thing.
Maybe 3 weeks. I'll push it out to 3 weeks.
Thanks.
Alrighty. Again, thank you, everybody, and that's all for today.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye-bye.